I want to talk to you about Botox. Botox, as you know, is a very popular substance used in cosmetic procedures to reduce the appearance of lines and wrinkles on the face. But Botox actually is the trade name of a chemical, actually a neurotoxin, that is produced by a bacterium that can be found in spoiled foods, often things that have been improperly canned. In fact, when I was in graduate school back in the late 1980s, I had to take a class in epidemiology, and we learned about the horrors of the disease called botulism, in which people would be paralyzed if they ate something that included the botulinum toxin in it. And, as I said, often from improperly canned foods or things that had not been stored right, sometimes meats. And it would often lead to death because it paralyzes muscles throughout the body. And if the toxin gets into the muscles involved in breathing, people can suffocate. So botulism was a horrible disease that had largely been eradicated with food safety procedures. So when I first heard about Botox, and I think it first came on the cosmetic scene in the late 1980s, right about the time. Actually, it was 1989 that the people who were working with it first discovered this benefit of it. So I guess it was in the early 1990s it became commercially available. And when people get Botox for cosmetic procedures, is microscopic amounts of the toxin are injected into the muscles to paralyze them. And it's the paralyzing of muscles that leads to the diminution of wrinkles. So I want to show you what I mean. So if you look on my forehead here, I have these what are called glabellar furrows, or what the cosmetics industry often calls the 11s. And these are lines. Actually, I've had those on my face since I was really young. My mother has them. They are somewhat accentuated from frequent use of corrugator muscle, corrugator supercilii, which is this muscle that brings the brows together and somewhat down, but mainly is involved in bringing the brows together. In fact, that is AU4, which is scored when the brows come down and together. AU4 involves 3 different muscles, but the corrugator muscle is what's involved in bringing the brows together and creating these vertical lines. How does Botox work? Well, in my neutral face, I'm just sitting here right now, not making any particular expression with my brow. There is tone in the muscles. And what we mean by tone is what keeps it kind of engaged. And so it's a low level of electrical activity in the facial muscles. There's tone in a lot of bodily muscles. You would notice tone more by the absence of it. So if someone has had a stroke, you might notice sometimes, depending on where the stroke is and there's improper input to the facial musculature, it might look like their face is kind of dragging or melting. That's the lack of facial tone. Okay, so with Botox, what they would do to get rid of these glabellar furrows is inject right around here microscopic amounts of botulism toxin to paralyze this tone, because these furrows are really from bulges. Furrows are shadows. So if I contract the corrugator more, and actually I'm bringing down the brows a little bit with procerus and depressor supercilii as well. But if I do this, it creates these bulges here, which cast a shadow. It's the shadow that is the furrow. And if people are lit well enough, you won't see those shadows. At any rate, if we put some botulism toxin in those muscles, it will flatten this out because the muscles will lose their tone, much like the melting face that can happen when people have facial paralysis, and you would see a smoothing out of those lines in the brow. That's how Botox works, and it's a huge industry. It's $1 billion industry, people getting rid of the wrinkles on their faces. So what's the problem with this? Well, you've kind of noticed probably that when people have their facial muscles paralyzed, they can't move their faces right. You can get a mask-like quality to the face. So a lot of the brows are so crucial to facial expression. Right now I'm lifting the frontalis muscle. These muscles also are often used for Botox. This area in here, even if they inject it in the glabellar region, it can have an effect on frontalis too. So people might not be able to fully lift their brows, or getting the brows oblique like you see in sadness or concern. It's interesting that there have been a number of psychological effects of Botox that have been discovered. Not all of them bad. One of them being has been used somewhat in the treatment of depression. And this is drawing on facial feedback theory, the theory that when we get feedback from our facial muscles to the central nervous system, it affects our emotions. So when you have an expression, like this, that might be associated with sadness or distress, the feedback from the periphery of the facial musculature can contribute to the experience of feeling sad. Small, regular Botox doses has been beneficial in the treatment of depression for some people, mild depression. However, there's a downside. Injections in the face with Botox also seems to diminish the experience of some positive emotions as well. Another downside is it reduces facial mimicry. Mimicry is one of the mechanisms by which empathy can develop. By mimicking the facial expressions of someone we are listening to or in conversation with, we are adopting the same facial affect, and from the feedback from the periphery, we can start feeling the same emotion. Now, there's a lot of other mechanisms of empathy, such as cognitive perspective taking, etc. This is not a discourse on empathy, but mimicry plays an important role in that. And in fact, studies indicate that when people have had Botox treatment, there is a reduction in empathic understanding. Another downside, of course, is just the cosmetic downside, and this is what I call the Botox Paradox. In a single frame, meaning a still photograph, someone might look better when they've had Botox. The wrinkles have been diminished, their faces look smoother, and they look younger. But as you may have noticed, if you've interacted with someone who's maybe had a little bit too much Botox or recent Botox, their faces don't move right, or they don't move naturally. So you might get real expressive down here and like a frozen brow. And that's disconcerting. In fact, work in social psychology from years ago shows that more animated faces are seen as more attractive. So what happens when you're dealing with a face that is not as animated or not properly animated? So there's a lot of pros and cons, a lot of things to consider when you're thinking about getting Botox done. Don't. I can't. I make a living with my face. I can't get Botox or fillers or cosmetic surgery, so it's just going to be good beauty care products for me.